Hello, welcome to TeleSUR. I'm Carla Gonzalez. This is Interviews from Quito, the program where we explore the big challenges facing this country and the region. In today's program, we'll look at the political scenario in Ecuador under the government of Lenín Moreno. Health, labor, and foreign ministers resigning, a fourth vice president in 3 years of term, and a government falling in approval ratings. So what could this lead to? In the next election, will the country recover from the austerity measures, and what will be the consequences for our nation? For that, we have professor and researcher at the University of Manabí, Fernando Casado. Thank you, Fernando, for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Carla.
So first, let's look at Ecuador. Give us a brief overview of what the country is going through politically.
Well, as you have mentioned, right now we have the fourth vice president in the country. That reveals that there is a very high level of instability in the country. At the same time that we are in a disastrous economic situation due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Here in Ecuador has hit very hard in the sense that it's probably the highest death toll in the whole America, and also one of the worst places where the pandemic has hit. In fact, we saw in the beginning of April those terrible images of dead people in the streets that the authorities could not do anything even to pick them up. So now, at the same time, this neoliberal agenda that the president has is also in a very bad way affecting the population with unemployment, the increase of poverty, a health system that is not able to assist the majority of the people. So the situation is really, really disastrous right now here in Ecuador.
So let's look a bit more at the issue of the vice president. How did we come to having 4 vice presidents in 3 years?
No, that's a very good question. The thing is, if we do like an overview of what has happened in Ecuador regarding the vice presidency position, first we had like in Ecuador, both president and vice president are elected through electoral vote in the presidential election. But the first vice president was an ally of Rafael Correa and Lenín Moreno, who was supposed to be a continuation government, just sort of make a turn towards liberal positions, break or betray even its own party and its own ideology. And then also in a way it was an obstacle to have Jorge Glass as his own vice president, since he was still loyal to Rafael Correa. And in this turn towards liberal positions, they also in a way, in a very obvious judicial procedure, he was imprisoned and right now he's in jail. So that was the first vice president, the one and the only one that was elected by the population in Ecuador. The second, Maria Alejandra Vicuña, she was elected by 3 candidates. That finally, that's how the procedure in Ecuador is. Once you have to elect a new vice president, it is the president who elects 3 candidates, and then the National Assembly, the legislative, is the one in charge of electing the one of those 3 candidates of the president. So the second one was after a few months in its position, was charged with bribing corruption charges. So she also had to resign. And the third one was a pact between the conservative parties and the president in order to regain sort of political stability in Ecuador. He was Otto Sonnenhoffner, and he was for about 1.5 years in office, and then resigned because since the very first day he got into office, he was just like gaining visibility in order to prepare, it seems like, its candidacy for being elected president in the next February elections in 2021. So now, the president again was forced to choose the 4th vice president. And it is interesting what has happened actually, because out of his list of 3 candidates, the 3rd one is the one that has been finally elected. And it is also even more interesting that she has been elected with the vote of the Correist force, which is probably out of the 137 assemblies or congressmen, is the biggest force with 30 votes. And they were the ones that sort of with the 30 votes finally gave pass to the election of Maria Alejandra Munoz. And the reason is that the other two candidates were really criticized by this force, and also because of their role, for example, during the 2019 protests against the government, where the one that was the first in the list, Maria Paula Romo, she was responsible of the repression, of the brutality of the police forces during the protests that has as an outcome 11 casualties, more than 1,100 to 1,200 wounded, and 1,300 people arrested. So that's why they sort of did everything they could in order to disregard the list of the three candidates of the president. But since the president of the legislative decided to go and vote for one of the three candidates, finally was the third one, probably the less dangerous one, according to the Correísta forces, the one that was elected with the votes of the Correístas. So that's the really unstable situation we are going through in Ecuador at the moment.
So you were mentioning she's the least, she's the candidate that the Correístas wanted, at least from the three options. But her office is also involved in a lot of scandals at the moment. She is the head of the customs agency, and that office is being involved in a corruption scandal of legislators being able to obtain disability documents to import cars, luxury cars, without paying taxes. How is that good for the country now?
Yeah. Imagine then, Carla, how is the situation in the country that she is the best candidate, because the other two were even worse than her, and she is involved in all those scandals you have mentioned, like these ID disabled cards that were used by high-ranking politicians in order to import into Ecuador luxury cars without paying taxes. So, and that's the best candidate. That's the candidate that the Correístas gave their support, because the other two were responsible mainly of the persecution of the political force of the Correístas. They were in charge of the repression, as I told you before, in the 2019 October protests. So, yeah, so instead of having a brutal repressor, they chose a corrupted vice president, which is probably better out of the three options, because as I told you, the president of the legislative didn't allow the discussion of the three candidates' proposals of the government. What could have been done? The legislative and the assemblies, the congressmen and women represented at the National Assembly could have also discussed if they agreed or not with the list. But the president of the legislative, who is an ally of the president, decided to vote for one of the three candidates without discussing if these three candidates could be rejected, and then the president would have been forced to choose another three different candidates. So among the three really bad candidates, this, the less worse, the less bad, was elected.
So there's a lot of illegalities in this process, apparently, according to the analysis. What other aspects can we see? Because there was a lot of talk on how the three people that were part of this list for vice presidents, they were all in their offices. They were all being, for example, ministers or the head of the customs agency. Could that be also analyzed as an illegality of this process?
Yeah, also, again, you see that the first in the list, Maria Paula Romo, is the Minister of Government. She only got out of 137 votes, 36 votes. The second, Juan Sebastián Roldán, the General Secretary of the Presidency, got just 12 votes. Also, as you said, Maria Alejandra Munoz was the head of the National Customs Service. So what also reveals is that Moreno has no capacity of choosing well-prepared candidates for the presidency, because maybe he has not even the chance to pick up people, because no one wants to get into an office that has such a big rotation and where most of the vice presidents in this term has either end in jail or have been accused of corruption, or now politicians are having very bad end. So in a way, it again shows how weak is the position of the president, that only relying on its closest allies can he create a list for having a new vice president.
So indeed, it is a very dangerous position to hold at this moment in Ecuador. But how does that leave the government in general, Lenín Moreno as the president, the government of the state of Ecuador, and how does it look politically stable or unstable?
Well, as I told you before, the situation of the government is very unstable. Lenín Moreno has the lowest levels of popularity in the region, probably, with around 5%. As we said before, there have been many scandals that are affecting the reputation of the government. This was supposed to be the government that was going to fight against the corruption, and then you have the so-called in a papers case that concerned the president himself, who would participate in offshore companies that are forbidden according to the Ecuadorian law. And however, due to also the protection of the Attorney General, the investigation has not gone forward. You have also many congressmen, also allies of the government, that have been prosecuted under corruption charges, damaging again the image of the government as well. And then also this really terrible scandal about this disabled ID you mentioned, where also many people have been involved. So I think that the government also, within the context of the coronavirus pandemic that has hit Ecuador really badly, is trying to survive. It's trying to get to February and then give or open the possibility of a different president after, in a way, Lenín Moreno has gone and done all the dirty job, in the sense that there has been a clear liberalization of the economy, shrinking the role of the state. We also see that the pandemic has hit very badly Ecuador because, for example, the budget devoted to health was reduced from over 4% to 2.8%, what made that Ecuador was badly prepared for the pandemic. Just in November, for example, a contract, a cooperation agreement with Cuba came to an end. 400 Cuban doctors were sent back to Cuba. Imagine how what an amazing job they could have done here in Ecuador if they were here. So I think that this really transition to this liberal economic situation in Ecuador is what he has done. And I guess that he's sort of praying for finishing his period as soon as possible, because the situation could not go worse.
Indeed. So apparently the president is not going for a re-election, but who knows? In Ecuador politics, we can see anything happening. But will it send another candidate, or which are the candidates that could at least defend the government for this part, or maybe present another proposal, an opposition, a very strong opposition to this government? We see former presidents that are also trying to run for presidency in 2021. How is that political scenario looking forward?
Yeah, that's actually a very good question. What is going to happen? Because I'm sure that the elite that is ruling now wants to continue ruling, because they lost power for 10 years during Rafael Correa's government, and now they have to prepare after this transitional government to rule with their own candidate, and not just with someone who turned towards them. That was the case of Lenín Moreno. So I think that obviously Lenín Moreno is not going to even think about the possibility of running again for the presidency, because as I told you, their reputation is extremely bad at the moment. But I think that how it worked from conservative positions was like they built up Otto Hoffner, the former vice president, as the candidate for the elections in the year 2021. Also, at the same time, they are taking all the measures in order to prevent the Correistas for having not just Rafael Correa as a candidate, as a president that is now forbidden after the referendum that took place in the year 2018, but even to prevent him from running as vice president with another candidate as a president. They are taking all the measures, even if they are illegal and they go against the international human rights convention. They are taking all the measures in order to prevent the whole Correísta as a political force from running in the presidency. And in a way, that's what they should do. Because if you look at all the statistics and the numbers that has been done, the Correistas are still in the first position as a political force in Ecuador. So of course, that would in a way end up with the plans of the elite and the right-wing political positions of gaining the presidency again in the year 2021. So on the one hand, we have few actors that are in a way positioning themselves to run for the presidency from right-wing parties and positions. And then we also have all these measures that are directed to prevent not only Rafael Correa for running as a vice president, but also the Correistas as a force to be in a way forbid in the next elections.
So if we look at the government now and try to compare a bit with other governments that Ecuador has had, and if we compare how many protests we've had against both of them, we can probably say that this government has sustained itself despite all the protests. We saw really strong protests back in October against the government, but it seems that they will continue, but the government is still in place. How can we analyze that part?
Yeah, the thing is that there was a very good opportunity to end up with the government in the protests of October 19. In that moment, the indigenous led this anti-neoliberal protest and they were at the verge of ending up the government, but they themselves, the leaders of the protest, decided not to go on because they thought that the best benefits would be picked up, sort of speaking, by the Correistas. And they were also against Correa and their policies during the decade they were in government. In that sense, what they did, the leaders of the protest and also the government, after almost 2 weeks of protest that has been the most bloody protest in 40 years of democracy in Ecuador. The worst toll in casualties, wounded, arrested, something never seen in Ecuador for the last 4 decades. But they made an agreement in order to sort of not put in place the reforms that would take away the subsidies to fuels. That was the agreement, but now, like just a month and a half ago, the government now, in a way, using the excuse of the impossibility of taking protest or carrying out any sort of protest against the government, they took away again the subsidies. Also now that the price of fuels are very, very low. So in a way, what we see is that this this government is not honoring its word. They are in a way doing whatever the IMF and different liberal institutions or the US government tell them to do. That's what the government is doing at the moment. And then applying also neoliberal policies that are really bad for the majority of the population, and they know that they are bad for the majority of the people. Unemployment is increasing. poverty and extreme poverty is increasing. Inequality is bigger every month, but still they apply these policies because this is what the elite also and the international institutions want. And the thing is that COVID-19 for this government, even if the death toll has been very high, according to the New York Times, actually 15 times bigger than the official figures. According to the official figures, we had at the moment like 8,500 dead people in Ecuador. Still, what happened is that thanks to the impossibility to protest against these liberal policies is why they are able to implement them. What we don't know is what is going to happen once the situation gets better in the country. The thing is that now the pandemic is really bad here, especially in Quito, in the capital of the country. It was really bad in Guayaquil, the second biggest city and important city in the country 2 months ago, but now it's really bad in Quito. But once that this situation, we overcome this situation, we don't know what can happen because the indigenous, the workers, the students, everybody is really fed up with the situation. And it is said, according to international institutions like the World Bank, that the decrease in the Ecuadorian economy is going to be over 10%. So again, people are not going to be able to overcome and all this suffering that is coming afterwards. If we already had unemployment, poverty, hunger, what is going to happen after all this pandemic and the normality or sort of normality comes back? Probably the protests will be unbearable. And if we consider that we have now political instability, once people are able to protest again, I don't know what can happen.
But it seems that the government is using the pandemic as an excuse to impose all these austerity measures, even though they promised the indigenous populations and the whole social groups that gather as a protest in October. Back in October, they promised them they would not apply it, but it's still in force. We see privatizations, we see the closure of public media, we see layoffs. How is that still affecting the economy of Ecuadorian workers?
Yeah, as I mentioned before, it is said that according to the World Bank, that the decrease in the GDP is going to be over 10%. So yeah, the situation is really, really bad. It's going to be probably a global crisis that in general, every country is going to undergo through a very difficult situation. But probably here in Ecuador is going to be worse than the average. And that's why I'm not sure what is going to happen, because if after the subsidy to the fuels were taken away and we had all these massive protests all over the country with over 3,000 indigenous coming to the capital in order to make the government stop with its liberal policies, once we see a sort of normality, most probably the protest will be even harder. And then I guess that also the government in a way is using, of course, as a scapegoat the COVID-19, but at the same time, in a way, to see in the horizon the presidential elections is the best way out for the current government. Take into account that so far, like 3 of the leaders of the indigenous communities have already propose themselves as pre-candidates for the presidency. So it means that they might, from here to February, better try to build up a good presidential proposal and try to run for the presidency, and then focus all the energy in that purpose and not protest. And so that could be sort of the way out they also see in order to regain power and to revert all the liberal policies that at the moment have been imposed. But we don't know what is going to happen because, as I told you, on the one hand, we have a really terrible political, economical situation that probably will lead to instability, but at the same time we have the hope of the presidential elections. Many of these candidates are already organized their campaign, so that might be the way that different forces will focus after we overcome the terrible situation that now we are suffering with the pandemic. How to get out of this nightmare through presidential elections.
Indeed, it is a very complicated situation, and I'm sure we will continue to discuss it throughout this year. Thank you for joining us, Fernando. We are running out of time, but thank you.
Thank you to you, Carla.
So we've been talking to Fernando Casado, professor and researcher at the University of Manabí, on the political uncertainty behind the government of Lenín Moreno in Ecuador just months before it ends, and what country it leaves behind for all of us to rebuild. Thank you for joining us. This is Interviews from Quito. I'm Carla Gonzalez. Until next time.